It's June the 11th, 2021, and our reading in 1 Samuel today is in chapter 27. But David thought to himself, one of these days I shall be destroyed by the hand of Saul. The best thing I can do is to escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will give up searching for me anywhere in Israel, and I will slip out of his hands. So David and the 600 men with him left and went over to Achish, son of Maoch, king of Gath. David and his men settled in Gath with Achish. Each man had his family with him, and David had his two wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail of Carmel, the widow of Nabal. When Saul was told that David had fled to Gath, he no longer searched for him. Then David said to Achish, "If I found favor in your eyes, let a place be assigned to me in one of the country towns, that I may live there. Why should your servant live in the royal city with you?" So on that day, Achish gave him Ziklag, and it has belonged to the kings of Judah ever since. David lived in Philistine territory for 1 year and 4 months. Now David and his men went up and raided the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites. From ancient times, these peoples had lived in the land, extending to Shur and Egypt. Whenever David attacked an area, he did not leave a man or woman alive, but took sheep and cattle, donkeys and camels and clothes. Then he returned to Achish. When Achish asked, "Where did you go raiding today?" David would say, "Against the Negev of Judah, or against the Negev of Jerahmeel, or against the Negev of the Kenites." He did not leave a man or woman alive to be brought to Gath, for he thought they might inform on us and say, "This is what David did," and such was his practice as long as he lived in Philistine territory. Achish trusted David and said to himself, "He has become so odious to his people, the Israelites, that he will be my servant forever." Amen. Now, David's situation has become so desperate that it leads him to deceive on many levels. He flees Israel. Verse 1, he thinks to himself, "I've got to do that to escape Saul." And where does he go? He goes back to the land of the Philistines. He goes back to Achish, king of Gath. Remember him? And he goes to live in that territory under the rule of that king, to serve him, to fight for him. Now, the last time we saw this happening, it was way back in chapter 21, and that was maybe the lowest point we've seen in David's experience up to this point, a time of utter degradation in chapter 21. But now David is esteemed by his enemies, the Philistines. He is honored by them. So much so that when he asks for it, he is given his own city called Ziklag to dwell in, verse 6. And this is not just for a fortnight or just a temporary refuge. He spends 1 year and 4 months in the Philistine camp. However, when he goes out raiding with his men, you remember it says he had 600 men, he attacks and totally wipes out these local pagan communities. They're mentioned in verses 8 and 9. Yet I think, reading between the lines is pretty obvious that he's giving the impression to Achish that he's actually attacking his own people, as if he's been kicked out by them, rejected by them, and now he's serving the Philistine cause, the enemy cause, going back to attack his own people. That's the impression that's given. And it earns him further esteem in the eyes of the Philistines and of King Achish, verses 10 to 12. His enemies, the enemies of God, the enemies of Israel, have now become his friend. And although he's playing this very shady, very tricky, double-sided sort of game, he finds himself now in one of the deepest places of unholy compromise in his life. Deception, the butchery of those different pagan towns, living with, serving the enemy of God, the enemy of his people. What a low condition we find David in here. And truly, this again to us is a warning. We are called to be God's holy people in the world. And this is reminding us, warning us again of what we are not to do and not to be. I don't think it's put anywhere more clearly than in 1 John chapter 2, verses 15 to 17. Do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For everything in the world, the cravings of sinful man, the lust of his eyes, and the boasting of what he has and does, comes not from the Father, but from the world. The world and its desires pass away, but the man who does the will of God lives forever.